I am beyond humbled to have Mr. Ion Sancho here today to talk with us about SB90 and anything else he wants to share with us from all of his gifts of the electoral process. So I will hand it over to you, Mr. Sancho.
Thank you very much, Nikki. And let me say it's a pleasure to address your organization. And for 28 years, I worked as a supervisor of elections in Leon County, and I thought I had seen it all. I had watched as from the 2000 election on, Republicans tried to game the electoral process to make it more difficult for Democrats to vote. And I raised 2000 because 2000 is the genesis of what we now are living with the big lie. The fact that the ex-president has said that he had his election stolen. We first heard those claims in the 2000 election, when the Republicans threw everything, the kitchen sink, to make sure that Florida could not count all its votes. And as a result, we didn't follow the election laws. Instead, we had a 37 days of chaos, which destroyed Florida's ability to count all of its votes, because we had a partisan Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, which, when given the opportunity to count citizens' votes or to go with a hard deadline, chose to go with a hard deadline and discard citizens' votes. So votes in Palm Beach County, in Miami-Dade, were never tabulated and counted, never. And it was a eye-opening experience for me. I never thought that anybody would try to steal a presidential election, but I will tell you that that veil was lifted from my eyes. And I recognize that our politics are as venal as can be, and that in fact, individuals don't want all of our citizens to vote. And from 2000 until now, I've watched that Republican assault on citizen voting rights and election administrators generally across the country take place. Let me jump into SB90 and explain to you that it's a broad-based attack. It's attack on citizens as voters. It's attack on election administrators as fair, impartial counters of the vote. And SB90 has some of the worst elements that I can imagine. So let me begin by telling you that the attack is primarily an attack on voting by mail, because the Democratic Party successfully had more than 1.5 million more vote by mail voters cast ballots than Republicans. And I don't know if many of you are regular readers, for example, of Politico, but on September 23rd, Gary Fineout released an article which consisted of looking at the emails of the Republican legislators that were crafting SB90. And Gary got a hold of those emails because a lawsuit had been filed. And in the course of discovery, those emails became available, which makes a complete lie of every one of the Republican statements relative to making sure our elections have guardrails. Those are not guardrails. Those are, in fact, rails thrown directly in the paths of voters to vote, particularly by mail. These emails, which cover the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, the Chairman of the Republican Party, said that this bill would make it easy as possible to vote and hard to cheat. And that was a lie, because in his own email, he said it would be devastating for Republicans to keep allowing Democratic voters to vote by mail in this same fashion. And so that's why we have this. That's why we have this bill. Gruters, by the way, who is a Republican from Sarasota, said it would hurt the Republican in nonpartisan races, such as school boards, which is why, by the way, Senator Grutter has filed a bill for the upcoming session to make all school board elections partisan, because they want partisan elections. They want to inflame their folks. And if it's a nonpartisan elections, it makes them more difficult to call them names, to call them Democrats, and to call them communists and whatever the other stuff that they're doing now. So there's a great article. If any of you want to see that, it's on Politico. It came out on September 23rd, and it really explains their thought process, which was to block Democratic voters from voting by mail, make it harder for those votes to be counted. And that's exactly what SB90 did. They did that in several ways. One, they placed limits on vote by mail drop boxes, which, by the way, is how I cast my vote in the 2020 presidential election, because I came down with some medical issues which prevented me from actually attending in-person voting in any way, shape, or form. Now, in some counties in South Florida in the 2020 election, they ran those vote by mail drop boxes 24/7. You could drop by after your work and just put it in the box. You could do it at 11 o'clock. You could do it when you got off of work. If you were a hospital worker and you had that late session, you could leave work and just drop your vote by mail in that drop box. All of that is now illegal. The limits on drop boxes are that drop boxes can only be open for the exact hours as your early voting locations are open. That's it. So in many locations where they run split hours, for example, they may run from 8 to 4 in some locations, and in other locations go from 10 to 6. You can only drop off your ballot during those specific hours that early voting site is open. They also made it illegal to use volunteers to help the supervisor of elections to provide security for those vote by mail drop boxes. The law says it has to be paid staff members, driving up the cost of vote by mail ballots and drop boxes for supervisor elections, hopefully so that they can't afford as many. It's a horrible idea, but it's how they're going to attack vote by mail balloting by Democratic voters. They also put limits on the collection of vote by mail ballots. In the 2020 election, only Miami-Dade banned individuals collecting ballots on behalf of others. In this legislation, that's banned outside of 2 ballots besides those in your immediate family. Only 2 members that you know, if a work compadre needs assistance, you can take 2 of those types of ballots. That's it. There was no limit prior to this legislation outside of Miami-Dade. They also restricted the ability for supervisor of elections to send out vote by mail applications without being requested. This was done generally by supervisor of elections of both parties in the state. Tammy Jones, for example, who's a Republican in Levy County. And I know this because she was the past president of the Association of Supervisor of Elections, sent those out to her voters because all of the supervisor of elections were concerned about COVID-19 and wanted to make the process as safe as possible. A feeling that is clearly not shared by the Republicans controlling the Florida legislature. So, for example, if she sends those out, she could be subject to fines. And fines have been added where they did not exist before. So this is an attack on your supervisor of elections as well. If the supervisor of elections, for example, leaves that vote by mail drop box open 1 minute longer than the early voting location, they are now subject to a $25,000 fine. That's what the Republicans are trying to do to the supervisor of elections, are trying to intimidate them to not serve their citizens as well. As my successor here in Leon County called it, a slap in the face of all the supervisor of elections in this state. And by the way, I will tell you that the Supervisor of Elections unanimously opposed SB90, which quite frankly is unheard of. I had never even heard in my 28-year career as a supervisor, we never took a vote to completely, on a unanimous basis, object to the legislation from the Florida legislature. The Supervisor of Elections did that with this bill. Another restriction, for example, is a ban on donations to election agencies. The Republicans blocked all additional federal funds going to Supervisor of Elections and elections administrators in the United States. There was something called the SAFE Act that the Democrats tried to pass, which would have given $400 million more to local election officials around the nation. The Republicans blocked that every time. And we did not have enough supplies and preparation to pay for all of the COVID-19 protections that were put into place, because the budget for the November election was adopted a year earlier, a year when there was no COVID. And so private organizations, the former governor, for example, of California, started a PAC to provide money to election officials. Mark Zuckerberg and his wife made a donation to a nonpartisan entity so that monies could be given to election officials who needed money for PPE and other COVID-related supplies. In this legislation, it makes that illegal for any supervisor of election to accept any private donation to help fund their office operation. Why? Because that got around the money block that the Republicans had thought they had placed around the election officials. And now for the next election, they want to make sure there isn't this avenue of private funds to allow election officials to buy more equipment, to buy PPP, to buy voting machines, and to provide the elements that, quite frankly, are not covered by the Florida legislature, because the Florida legislature, I want to make you aware of this, provides no monies to Supervisor of Elections offices. All the money comes from your county coffers, every single penny. And you know that county commissions are not overwhelmed with extra money. So this really catches Supervisor of Elections in Florida's counties, because some Supervisor of Elections have even told me, how can I ask for new voting machines for additional early polling place when my county doesn't have enough ambulances, when we don't have enough fire protection? So again, these private monies were used across the state by both types of officials, both Democratic and Republican. I'm aware of 9 Republican Supervisor of Elections that received these grants so that they could have their citizens' votes. Gone, banned forever. Also, Supervisor of Elections are banned from entering into consent decrees. And this means that, for example, if a Supervisor of Elections is sued because they don't have something done properly, in the past, we could enter into a consent decree and take that to the county commission and force the county commission to give us additional monies. I've done that myself. New legislation passes, I go to the county and say, look, I need this. There is an exception in the Florida Constitution so that in fact, you can have unfunded mandates in the state of Florida for elections. That's in our constitutional amendment for unfunded mandates. Elections are excluded. So the legislature can pass onerous restrictions, send them to the counties, and they don't have to pay for it. That comes out of the county budget, which they have to give you. So these restrictions are not only a tax on election officials, but on the voters. And they've made it easier for partisan officials to interfere with our elections. In the past, no member, a Democrat or Republican, can come and look at our processes as we're processing ballots and see people's signatures. You can now, And so for a party that really says that identity theft is an issue, they're making it more easy for citizens to have their identity stolen by partisans who now have greater access to overlook the process. A process that, quite frankly, as Governor DeSantis said, worked flawlessly. Florida was the gold standard of elections in the 2020 election. I've been watching them closely for almost 30 years. This was the best large election that Florida ever administered. And quite frankly, as an observer of elections, the 2020 election was the best large turnout election I ever witnessed in my life. The best turnout in a century. And what was the reward for Florida's actions? Well, getting kicked in the teeth for making the process too simple and too accessible for our citizens. They've also made it more difficult for your organization, for example, to register voters as a third-party voter registration group. If you are, for example, at a voter registration drive and you're collecting voter registrations at a mall, say in Palm Beach County, and you have somebody that drove up from Miami-Dade and they registered to vote, if you turn in that voter registration application to the Supervisor of Elections in Palm Beach County, you're going to be fined. You must now separate all the voter registration applications by the county and send them to the right county Supervisor of Elections, or you'll be fined for every wrong application you send to the wrong Supervisor of Elections, something that is completely irrelevant because Supervisor of Elections transmit information on a daily basis to other counties. Putting this barrier in there strictly is to try to catch you, to fine you, and to make you and other organizations less likely to do voter registration, as was another element in SB90, which says as a third-party voter registration group, you must tell the individual that you're registering that they might not get registered by filling out that application with you. This is ludicrous. This is ludicrous. You're registering a voter and you have to tell them that they might not be registered by doing this. So fortunately, there are a number of lawsuits which have been filed, one specifically on this issue with third-party voter registration. And the final thing that I'd like to throw out, which is that they gave Governor DeSantis the ability to take citizens' elections away. For example, let's use Broward counties right now. A number of Broward County commissioners have filed to run for former Alcee Hastings' seat. In the past, those individuals who have filed to resign to run would have those county commission positions filled at the next election. No longer. The Republicans gave the power to the governor to fill those Democratic county commission seats with Republicans for the rest of their term. So there were a number of little goodies tossed into SB90. Not only was it a voter suppression attack on citizens to try to intimidate Supervisor of Elections, to make voting by mail more difficult, but to make the entire elections administration less fair in this state. And I've been working with individuals across the country to bring lawsuits. There are a number of lawsuits on this issue. But until they're cleared up, this is what we're going to have to work with. And I will tell you, because this was an attack on vote by mail ballots, they left all early voting rules unchanged. Why? Well, because the Democrats and Republicans voted about the same in terms of early voting, and the Republicans didn't want to impact on their individuals who went to in-person early voting. So that's the one tidbit I'll throw out. If you like voting early in person, that time period of 15 days is still available with no additional restrictions, because again, most of the direct impacts were on voting by mail and asking for an application to vote by mail. They've actually now put in a tricky little provision which says If you call up to ask for a vote by mail ballot, you must give them the identifier that is provided that you provided them on the voter registration application. However, the information that they're asking for was not required until after 2006. So, for example, those of you who are my age, and I've been registered to vote since I hit Florida in 1970, we don't have those identifiers, which is your Florida driver's license or your Florida ID number or the last 4 digits of your social security number. They're not in our file. When you call up the Supervisor of Elections office and ask for a vote by mail ballot, in 2020, they just asked for your birth date and confirmed your address. This time, you're going to have to provide them with this matching number, which, if you've registered before 2006, you won't have. And so they will not be able to send you a vote by mail. It essentially requires you to re-register to vote again to get a vote by mail ballot now with SB90. And this is cruel, completely unnecessary. And again, a potential for identity theft, which is why when I did my update recently, I gave them the last 4 digits of my social security number. So the next time I ask for a vote by mail ballot, I know it's in my record. That's what I'll tell them. I will give them the last 4 digits, and they will be required to send me a ballot. But again, if you've not updated your vote by mail or your profile recently, it's the equivalent of registering to vote again. So that's basically a quick run through of Senate Bill 90 and some of its negative impacts, which is clearly designed to make voting by mail more difficult, something that Governor DeSantis said had to be done, and has of no value in terms of security and protection of the citizens in terms of its positive impact on us. So that's sort of SB90. And that is, it's happening all over the country. Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. And if you notice one of these things, 2 factors are present in all of these types of statutes. One, they're all done in states with control by Republican legislators. The only states that blocked it were Kentucky and Louisiana, because they had Democratic governors that were vetoed, and in Michigan. But in Michigan now, the Republicans are trying to collect petitions to bypass and overturn the governor's veto of the legislation there. Also in Pennsylvania, the Republican legislature was also blocked there by Governor Tom Wolf, a Democrat. But if there is Republican control of the legislature, governor's race, you're going to see the voter suppression laws being expanded. There are there's a couple of good pieces of news that I want to share right off the bat before I open up for questions and answers, which is really the most exciting part of this for me. And that is that we have 3 constitutional amendments, which were written and filed on May 28th by Sean Shaw. I don't know if many of you remember Sean. He ran for Attorney General. And I will tell you that if your organization has any extra time, any extra focus at all, these constitutional amendments are the only vehicle that I see to overturn some of the most heinous actions by the state of Florida. For example, one of these amendments would overturn the restrictions that the Florida legislature and Governor DeSantis imposed upon Amendment 4, the restoration of rights. Sean has written an amendment, which he can get the right number of signatures, says that the restoration of voting eligibility shall not be denied because of any debt, including legal, financial, obligations. This amendment does not release any person from their duty to pay any debt. You're just not barred from voting because you have it. It's an excellent constitutional amendment. It's called 2108 Voting Eligibility Restoration Amendment. This would overturn what the legislature and a biased Supreme Court, in my opinion, have done to prevent these individuals who have fully served their sentences from, again, having a stake in our society, something that would help our communities all across the state of Florida. The second amendment that Sean has introduced is the Register and Vote Amendment. And this amendment, 2109, would allow individuals to both register and vote when they at early voting or on election day. This is election day voting registration and voting, which over 20 states in this country have, including Republican states. So this is not a crazy idea. And in fact, those states that have election day registration are the highest voting turnout states in the country. This has been an idea that's been going around for a long time. But again, the simple language would allow for individuals to register and vote at the same time. You have to provide the same proof that you would when you register on the normal time. So the eligibility requirements have not been changed at all. And in fact, would just eliminate the 30-day rule, or actually 28-day rule, that this country in Florida has to bar citizens from registering and voting. And the protections are there, the same requirements. It's an excellent idea. And finally, the last one he did, which is 2110, a voter registration method for eligible voters. Right now, when you register to vote at the highway safety and motor vehicles or the driver's license agencies or any of the agencies where you can do it, they're required by law to ask you, would you like to register to vote? This turns the process around and will automatically register citizens when they go get their driver's license, unless the citizen opts out. So again, it puts the onus on opting out as opposed to opting in, which in those states that have a process like this has a much higher voter registration percentage of their citizens successfully being registered on this opt-in procedure. So these are the three, 2108, 2109, and 2110 that Sean Shaw has authored. And I'm going to do my level best over the course of the next year to try to help collect petitioners collect petitions. These would overturn much of the negative voter suppression activities that the Florida legislature, run by Republicans, have engineered to ensure that citizens are blocked from voting. And if we can get these three amendments passed, it's a good thing. So these are what I'm recommending as the option for the Democratic Party, for all organizations that are interested in making voting more accessible. For example, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, where we have FPIRGs and student organizations on the campus. These things are good. They provide the same level of security that we had, and they do a great, great, great benefit to allowing accessibility to our voting processes, which we need since the Republicans in this state have made it their policy to ensure that citizens are barred whenever possible. And with that, I'm going to stop and open up for questions that you may have on SB90 or any other element of Florida's elections process that you might be interested.
Awesome, Sancho. Thank you so much. And we're happy to hear the advocacy for Sean Shaw. He is a member of this organization as well, and I'm sure he is due to circle back here in the next month or so to give us an update on where he is and where we can help. So we'll start our first question here with Dietrich. Dietrich, do you want to ask your question?
I'm traveling, and I may go in and out.
I'll do it for you. Yeah, her question is, do you think we will have these restrictions if more Republicans voted by mail?
No, we had no restrictions from 2002 when voting by mail became the law with no reasons. From 2002 to 2020, we had basically the same rules. And during that entire period of time, we had more Republicans voting by mail than Democrats. 2020 is the first time more Democrats used the vote by mail process, 1.5 million more. And that's why they've thrown these restrictions on vote by mail. And you raise an issue that is very prescient, and that is this may hurt Republican voters as well. They did not look at that. This is just a knee-jerk reaction to attack the Democratic voters who signed up through the successful voting drives of your organizations and other Democratic organizations to vote by mail. And quite frankly, if the voters jumped over and started swelling the early voting centers, you'll probably see in the next election cycle, the Republicans put restrictions on early voting because they are bound and determined to try to keep the number of Democratic voters down in the state of Florida. That is their stated goal, both in the September 23rd political story clearly states that. And it's something that I've been watching for almost the majority of my career, watching them restrict voters and trying to change the laws to make it more difficult for students, voters that are not tuned into the voting process, which they perceive there are more Democratic voters in that category than Republicans. That's how they're attacking the process. So vote by mail is attacked because Democrats successfully used vote by mail in the 2020 election.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ms. Joy Burgess. Joy, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Sancho. Your presentation was wonderful. My question is, as we're looking at all of the things going on nationally, and it's my understanding that the Freedom to Vote Act or the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, if passed, would help us at the local level, would protect us from these local voter suppression bills like SB90. If that is true, what can we do to nudge our Congress to do something? Because it's all over the place.
Well, unfortunately, you have a Senate whose filibuster rules require that 60 votes be in favor of anything before it can be passed, unless it's in reconciliation or is an internal party rule. There probably is, using the vice president's vote, 51 votes to pass the Right to Vote Act, which, by the way, is fabulous. If we could pass just any one single bill, the Right to Vote bill would be my choice. Because the Right to Vote bill is written by people, lawyers, consultants who looked at how the current Republican Supreme Court has stripped voting rights away from citizens, and it inserts language which requires the Supreme Court to adjudicate this issue in a completely different manner. It requires the Supreme Court to finally treat your vote as a fundamental right. As someone who has a law degree and has been in this area in a long time, I can tell you that you do not have a fundamental federal right to vote in federal elections. It doesn't exist, which is why and how the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore was able, by a 5-4 vote, and block Florida from counting all the votes cast in the presidential election. The only state, the only time in history, a state was not allowed to complete its election count. That was it, 2000. And that's because you don't have a right to vote. The Right to Vote Act would essentially take constitutional language and insert it, and so that the Supreme Court would have to use those standards that make your right to vote fair and fundamental, and can only be restricted by states if it's the only and least restrictive method they have to overcome some sort of fraud, because that's what the Republicans are saying. We're passing this law to stop fraud. Well, this language would say your bill has to be specific and the least restrictive measure to attain the goal that you seek. In other words, no broad bans on these citizens or those citizens, which is now the current process. So again, it's written to overcome the shenanigans of the Republicans, which have now taken control of the United States Supreme Court, and completely denies the history of voting from the 1965 voting rights up until the 1990s. The Supreme Court has essentially overturned all of these rules, which did hold that the right to vote was fundamental. They've made it now a privilege, which is why they upheld voter IDs in the state of Indiana, for example, in the Supreme Court case, even though Republicans in the state of Indiana could not point to one fraudulent voter in the history of their state ever casting a fraudulent vote. And the Supreme Court said, it doesn't matter, we don't need evidence. The state says that's what it's doing. We're just going to accept the state's word. Excuse me. This bill now says you have to have evidence. You must have evidence, and it has to be the least restrictive manner. And that is now something that the courts can measure, which right now, all the ties go to the state, not to the citizen, because your right to vote is not fundamental anymore.
Wow. Thank you.
I believe Molly is up next. Molly, you have a question?
Yeah, and you, thank you so much, Mr. Sancho. You probably have already answered this, but I wanted to know specifically in Florida, what can we do as individuals to thwart these efforts in the upcoming 2022 election, or even the ones this fall? Are there actions we can take?
Well, as we have been controlled by the Republicans completely since 1998 in Florida, there are really nothing at the state level at all that we can do. And that Republican control has extended into local governments. For example, the state has now preempted local government's control. Here in Tallahassee, for example, in Leon County, we had restrictions that we placed on campaign contributions. Well, the law allowed contributions to go up to $3,000. In local races, the Leon County Commission had imposed a $250 campaign cap so that individuals couldn't buy the elections. They had to actually go out and meet people. And within the year, the Supreme Court has said, no, we're preempting all of those. They're turning over charter amendments that were imposed, for example, in Orange County. Orange County put restrictions on their constitutional officers. And the Supreme Court, on their own initiative, overturned those local charters. And so in terms of real concrete legislation, there's little we can do except constitutional amendments that have one subject only, which is why Sean Shaw used 3 different constitutional amendment initiative petitions to make these 3 changes, because the court has already shown in the striking down of the legalized marijuana legislation, they're going to look with a jaundiced eye. There was nothing wrong with their constitutional amendment, but it didn't mention that it's still illegal under federal law. Because it didn't mention that, they threw out the amendment for Florida. So Republicans are going to use every trick in the book they can to prevent any changes to their procedures. One of the things that we can do is start talking about how directly the Republicans are trying to stop people from voting. Everyone, including decent-minded Republicans, believe that the right to vote is a good thing, except that we are not really explaining and showing to people how this voter repression works, because it impacts on us. We talk about it among ourselves, but quite frankly, we need to start using social media. We need to get this out to people, to young people, to let them know, hey, you're being targeted. They're trying to make it harder for your votes to count. For no other reason is that younger people vote more Democratic than other entities, so you're a target. To use social media, to write where we can letters to the editors, get more information out there. We need to build a groundswell among the citizens, because I believe a majority of the citizens believe that the right to vote is a fundamental right, that Americans have that access. And it goes all the way back to the Declaration of Independence in that second paragraph, where we talk about, we the people, in order to form this more perfect government that we have, that is talked about in the Constitution, it's the will of the governed. The will of the governed is the sacrosanct determiner of who we are. Blocking the will of the governed is exactly contradictory to the most basic ideals of our republic. Our republic was founded on the concept that the will of the governed is in fact how our government should be governed. Now, we've had a long journey. That arc of justice has taken a lot of twists and turns to go from a group of individuals who only allowed white landed men to vote, to finally allowing women to vote in the beginning of the 20th century, and finally allowing African Americans to exercise their franchise in 1965. For a full 100 years after the Civil War, African Americans in the South could not vote. It was American apartheid writ across our land. And African Americans actually in the South only got the right to vote in 1965, within our lifetimes. And so this is, unfortunately, the Supreme Court is rolling this back now. And we need to talk about the fact that every citizen has a right, as a citizen, to have their will expressed and counted as they intended at the ballot box. And until that kind of universal ethic becomes accepted, we're going to have to fight that war every day for the rest of our lives.
Thank you. I think up next, we'll do a couple more here. Linda Thigpen, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I think I put it in the chat though. Good evening, everyone. My question is, how do we obtain these petitions? How many must be collected? And when are they going to be disseminated?
Well, I did not contact Sean Shaw before I talked to you. I just printed out his amendments. There are petitions which have to be printed and circulated. And my spouse, for example, was out collecting petitions the other day. And they're not complex. They require a name and address. They require a birth date. And essentially, you sign that you want this amendment. You'd have to sign 3 different amendments to get all of these 3 in. And I would suggest contacting Sean Shaw directly. I have his telephone numbers here, if you'd like me to give them to you. His organization lists 2, 850-933-6025 and 850-879-3236.
Thank you. Can someone put it in the chat? I'm not where I have a pen to write it down.
Yes, I certainly will.
How many must be collected, sir?
We need to collect close to 1 million of these signatures in, quite frankly, a little less than a year and a half. The Republicans have successfully limited the time that petitions can be collected. It used to go all the way until the August before the November election. They'll terminate in February now of the election year. So we have not a lot of time. They need 800,000 plus on each one of these. And they've made it more difficult for the Supervisor of Elections to verify these by essentially turning off that function in the Florida State database that allowed the supervisors to use that to verify petitions. That has not been turned on for Supervisor of Elections to use. So it makes it a little bit more difficult now for supervisors to verify every one of the signatures on the petition, because that's how we ensure that a registered voter signs the petition. So again, contact Sean Shaw, tell him that you're interested in this, that it's important. And I will be doing that this week myself, because I've got to get some petitions and I'm going to try to collect them through my friends.
I think this is absolutely scandalous. As a segue to my next question, if I may, you may mention that if persons collect signatures or new registrants for voter registration and they went to the wrong county, they can be assessed a fee. But how can the state know that it went to the wrong county unless it's mandated for the local supervisor election office to report it?
And unfortunately, they'll have to do that. If you send a voter registration application, for example, to Christine White in Miami-Dade, and it should have gone to Broward County, she's going to have to report that, and she will be levying the fine because that's what the law requires. She'll have to be levying fines on her own citizens as opposed to the state. And again, this is how they've prostituted this whole process. It is against the supervisors as well as the citizens, because the supervisors did too effective a job allowing access to the voting rolls last time.
Well, it seems to me the only way we can circumvent all of these actions is to increase the voting, get these Republicans out of office. Thank you so much for answering my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Thigpen. We'll take our last question here, and it's from Shan Rose. Shan,
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. So I am the young person that you're speaking of, and full disclosure, I am a candidate in the local City of Orlando District 5 elections. And while I was out petitioning voters, the frustration is lack of polling locations, the lack of consistency from the presidential election, the gubernatorial election. As a party, how do we ensure equity in local elections? Because your local elections become frustrated. If you gather, if you gather all of these people and you say, let's get out to vote, and there's a sense of suppression because you don't have access to as many polls as you would, or you don't have access to early voting. How, as a party, do we come together and fix that locally?
Well, that's a good question. And one of the things that citizens have to do is go to the Supervisor of Elections office, develop a relationship. In Orange County, you need to develop a relationship with Bill Cowles. You need to talk to him about the frustrations that you're having. I will tell you that Supervisor of Elections actually like having their citizens vote For example, that's how they got in the office, except in Miami-Dade, where their local charter makes it an appointment, and the rest of the state. And so I would routinely have individuals meet me in my office with their questions. We explain the process. And yes, if you want to suggest better polling locations, do that. Supervisor of elections are not super people, and they're trying the best they can with the limited dollars they have. But unless you've got a supervisor of elections as awful as in Jacksonville, where they refuse to allow an early voting location in the same stadium that the Jacksonville Jaguars play, which was offered to them by the team president and they were denied. Or in Miami-Dade, where the same thing happened, where the Miami Heat said, use our location for an early voting location. And the mayor who appointed the supervisor said, no, you can't do that. Well, you need to know that. So go to the supervisor of elections office, ask for more polling locations, ask for more convenient, and make suggestions. If there's a community center that's being used, suggest that, look, this site helps the community. You have nothing around the community, and this is a help. Be a helper to the supervisor of elections. Be their eyes and ears in the community. And if they reject you, guess what? Now you have someone who you can talk about directly with information about someone who is not being helpful to the citizen voting process that we must have if we are going to have that one nation with liberty and justice for all. So get involved with your supervisor of elections. If you're a candidate, you need to meet them. You need to show them that you've got concerns in the community. So again, they're a public official. And if they do something bad, they're going to have people run against them. As, for example, the former supervisor of elections in Duval County has said he's going to run against this individual who refused to put an early voting site at Edwards Waters HBC University, or refused to have a voting location at the Jacksonville Jaguars field, because he's got evidence now. And so when he runs for that position, he's going to be saying, we need more positions here. So again, get involved with your supervisor of elections. Don't give them a free pass. Place demands on them. And they can designate a site as an early voting site as long as it's 30 days before the election. So you want to meet with them early. Make the suggestions early. And you know what? You might be helping them out and helping your community out at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ione, for joining us tonight. Mr. Sancho, this has been a wonderful presentation. I think all of us learned a lot of information. As Cornelius Jones said in the comments, we wish more people were here to have listened to it tonight, but we did record it. So we'll be able to send out a link to the recording of this segment of it, just so people can get the information. So super excited about that. And thank you again. Thank you for taking the time this evening and sharing so much with us.